We're leaving tonight, Mum. I sold your car and the condo. But what she didn't know was the words hit me like a physical blow. Mum, we're leaving tonight. It was a Tuesday afternoon, grey and chilly, a perfect reflection of the emptiness that had settled in my heart since John passed. The phone felt like an anvil in my hand. I could hear the rustle of luggage in the background, the familiar, hurried sounds of my daughter Sophie and her husband Mark. I'd imagined these sounds before, but they were always tied to a joyous vacation, not this chilling finality. For the past 8 months, they had been my only connection to a world that felt increasingly distant. They'd been so attentive, so caring, or so I had foolishly believed. Now her voice, usually so bright and full of life, was flat, devoid of warmth. I barely had time to process the first part of the sentence before the next, more brutal blow landed. I sold your car and the condo. The receiver went silent for a moment. I could hear Mark say something to her, a low whisper I couldn't quite make out. Then she was back on the line, her voice brittle. We're going to Europe. This is a huge opportunity, Mum. We needed the money. I've wired a portion to your account. It's enough to get you settled somewhere else, maybe a nice retirement community. The words felt like polished stones, cold and hard. A retirement community. The very thought made my skin crawl. It was the place you went to wait for your last breath. My breath hitched. The condo. Our home for 40 years. The car, John's pride and joy. The objects of my memories, my past, my life with him. She had turned them into a transaction. Without a word, without a question, she had taken everything. But Sophie, I whispered, what about my belongings? My art? I could hear the impatience in her sigh. Mum, we're on a tight schedule. We'll send someone to pack up your things later. You don't need all that old stuff anyway. It's just clutter. Just clutter. The love, the laughter, the years, all reduced to clutter. Bye, Mum. I'll call you when we get there. And just like that, she was gone. The phone went dead. I stood there, frozen, the dial tone a buzzing anthem of betrayal. For 45 years, I had dedicated my life to her. I had given up my career as a promising artist to be a teacher, so I could be home for her. We had sacrificed, saved, and built a life together. And in one 2-minute phone call, she had erased it all. The world tilted on its axis, and I felt a grief so profound it overshadowed even the sorrow of John's death. I walked to the living room, my legs unsteady. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. John's favourite chair was still in its spot, his art books neatly stacked beside it. My heart ached for him. If only he were here. He would know what to do. The sorrow welled up, a tsunami threatening to drown me. But then, as I was about to sink into the familiar depths of grief, something caught my eye. A small wooden box on the mantelpiece, tucked behind a framed photo of John and me. He had given it to me on our last anniversary, but I'd never found a good place for it, so I'd simply left it there, forgotten. My hands trembled as I reached for it. It was a beautiful, hand-carved box, smooth and cool to the touch. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single key, a key I had never seen before. A small, neat tag was attached to the key with a string. My name was handwritten on it in John's familiar, elegant cursive. I flipped it over. The letters NYB were etched on the back, along with the number 708. A chill ran down my spine. The New York Bank, a place where we had never had an account. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What was this? Then another discovery. A small, thin manila envelope taped to the bottom of the box. My fingers fumbled with the tape, my mind racing. Inside was a letter, addressed to me. "My dearest Martha," it began. My eyes filled with tears, a mix of grief and something else. Something I couldn't quite name. He had known. My God, he had known. He had known what I would go through. And he had left a path for me. The tears streamed down my face, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of a deep, bone-deep realization. I was not alone. The story was not over. In that moment, a quiet strength, a determination I hadn't felt in years, took root in my soul. I was going to fight. I was going to find out what was going on, and I was going to get back what was mine. The key. It felt heavy and cold in my palm, a tiny piece of metal that somehow outweighed the grief and shock of the last hour. NYB 708, New York Bank. I smoothed out the letter John had taped to the box's bottom. His handwriting was steady, utterly unlike the shaky scrawl you'd expect from a man in failing health. John had always been deliberate. That was one thing I loved and occasionally teased him about. He never did anything on a whim. "My dearest Martha," the letter began, "if you are reading this now, it means I've finally left you alone with your books and your quiet morning's doings. I know you will be hurting, but I need you to understand something important. I didn't want to burden you while I was alive, but I also wanted to protect you from the worst parts of the world. Not the storms, not the sickness, but the small, quiet kinds of greed that break families." My eyes blurred. He had foreseen this. He had seen the potential for Sophie's avarice, or perhaps Mark's influence, and prepared a defense. "The key is for the safe deposit box at the main New York branch, box 708. Inside you will find the truth about the money, the art, and everything else they think they've taken from you. They believe we are poor. They believe they have salvaged the last bits of our meager savings. Let them believe it, for now. This is your weapon, Martha. Use it not for revenge, but for education. Not to punish, but to teach. I love you, and I will always be with you, even if they've taken the canvas I gave you." The canvas. The golden sunset, my one real piece of artwork. The one I had refused to sell. The one John had treasured. Sophie had sold it. That hurt more than losing the condo. It wasn't clutter, it was love. A hot flush of anger, sharp and clear, burned away the last vestiges of my self-pity. I grabbed my coat and called a cab. There was no time to wait. I needed to see Ms. Rodriguez, John's lawyer, the one who handled his estate. I had only met her once, briefly, after the funeral. The next morning, Ms. Rodriguez's office was sleek and modern, a contrast to my dusty old condo. She was sharp, with an intimidating gaze that softened when she saw the key. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, gesturing me to sit. "I've been waiting for you to call. John made it clear that this key was the final piece of the puzzle. I had strict instructions not to discuss any of this until you presented it." I laid the key and the letter on the polished glass table. Sophie sold the condo and the car. She left town with Mark, telling me I was being moved to a home. She took everything she thought we had. Ms. Rodriguez nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "I see. Well, let me bring you up to speed, Mrs. Brooks. Mr. Brooks was not just a high school art teacher." She pulled up a file on her screen. "For the last 25 years, John used his quiet time not just to teach, but to curate." "Curate what?" I asked, leaning forward. "He invested every spare penny, every bonus, and every inheritance he received in fine art before the market exploded. He focused on emerging American masters and European post-impressionists. He bought low and held on. I stared at her, dumbfounded. John was an art teacher. He wasn't a collector. We lived modestly. We drove old cars. The contents of that safe deposit box are the legal titles, the appraisals, and the deeds. Mrs. Brooks, your husband's private collection is conservatively valued at $10 million. The number hung in the air, vast and unreal. $10 million. I felt a slight wave of nausea. But that's not all, Ms. Rodriguez continued, leaning in conspiratorially. The collection needed a safe haven, a place to be stored and maintained without attracting attention. So John purchased a property in Napa Valley, California. Not a condo, Mrs. Brooks. A vineyard. A working vineyard, which he ran through an investment firm, completely anonymously. The vineyard property alone is worth an additional $4.5 million. I gripped the arms of the chair. My condo was gone. My car was gone. But I was sitting here, listening to a lawyer tell me I was the sole heiress to a fortune that included a vineyard in California. It was the twist extreme I never could have imagined. John had not just saved us, he had elevated us to a level of wealth I never dreamed of, all while driving a 20-year-old sedan and teaching teenagers how to sketch still life. So Sophie, she truly believes she has impoverished me. Absolutely, Ms. Rodriguez confirmed. She believes she has taken your last assets to fuel her business venture. And I'm afraid she's in a worse position than she thinks. We need to discuss the state of her own finances. Ms. Rodriguez opened another file. The paper she slid across the table was a bank statement. The bold letters at the top screamed past due. Sophie and Mark are not successful entrepreneurs, Mrs. Brooks. They are deep in debt. My heart, which had just soared, sank a little. How deep? Based on this preliminary report, Ms. Rodriguez stated, her voice grave, they currently owe over $750,000 to various creditors. And that's not including the fact that Mark appears to have falsified Sophie's signature on several loan documents. The anger returned, cold and hard. This wasn't just theft. It was betrayal and fraud. Sophie hadn't just tried to secure her future. She had been running away from a disaster she and Mark had created. I looked back at the key, then at the letter. Use it not for revenge, but for education. Ms. Rodriguez, I said, my voice steady, the teacher in me re-emerging. We need to retrieve my condo and my car immediately, but I want to do it quietly. I want Sophie and Mark to hit rock bottom. I want them to learn, truly learn, the price of their choices. You're planning to let them fail? No, I corrected, a slight smile forming on my lips. I'm planning to let them experience the consequences of their own actions. We'll start by buying back the condo. And then, we wait. And the New York Bank safe deposit box was the key to more than just John's fortune. It was the key to my freedom. Miss Rodriguez and I took the earliest train to Manhattan, the entire trip a blur of financial jargon and shocking revelations. By the time we walked into the sleek marble lobby of the bank, I wasn't Martha Brooks, the recently betrayed art teacher. I was the silent owner of a multi-million-dollar estate, and I felt a cold, focused clarity I hadn't known since my 20s. Inside Box 708, the reality of John's genius hit me in a wave. It wasn't just bank statements and stock certificates. There were deeds, insurance policies, and most importantly, a detailed, handwritten inventory of his art collection. He hadn't just collected, he had documented. Every appraisal, every date of acquisition, every carefully masked transaction was recorded in John's meticulous hand. The key to the collection is provenance, Mrs. Brooks, Ms. Rodriguez murmured, flipping through the appraisals. John's records are flawless. This makes everything airtight. We can liquidate any piece at any time, but I suggest we use the art as collateral, not as cash. The total valuation confirmed her earlier estimate, $10 million in art alone. I was looking at wealth that Sophie couldn't even fathom. The thought of my daughter trying to sell my beat-up old Honda for a few $1,000s, while I held the deed to a vineyard worth $4.5 million, was grimly satisfying. Then, we got to the difficult part. Ms. Rodriguez laid out the full scope of Sophie and Mark's financial disaster. The $750,000 debt was conservative. Mark had leveraged their small Manhattan apartment, which they didn't actually own, and sunk hundreds of thousands into a sham tech startup that had collapsed 6 months ago. The European trip wasn't a business venture. It was a panicked attempt to flee the country and avoid bankruptcy and potential lawsuits. They believe they have bought themselves time with the sale of your assets, Ms. Rodriguez explained, tapping a pencil against the document. But the money from your condo and car won't even cover the interest on their outstanding loans for long. The creditors are closing in. And what about the fraud? Mark using Sophie's signature, I asked, my voice tight. We have evidence he utilized a power of attorney she signed during a moment of distress, perhaps right after John's funeral. We can legally challenge it, but it will be messy, a public scandal. I leaned back, taking a moment to process the full weight of the situation. John's letter came back to me. Use it not for revenge, but for education. My goal wasn't to destroy Sophie, but to wake her up. If I stepped in now, she'd never truly learn. She'd just see me as her unlimited ATM. Ms. Rodriguez, I want to execute the first phase of my plan immediately. I want the condo back, and I want the car back. But I want both transactions finalized through a shell company with an ironclad confidentiality agreement. The buyer must be completely anonymous, especially from Sophie and Mark. We can arrange that. We'll file a civil suit based on the fraudulent sale, but we'll settle out of court with the current buyer. It will look like a private corporation, a third party, is simply reclaiming the asset. Perfect. And the car, too. I want my old Honda back. It was John's last birthday gift. It's done. We can have the condo back in escrow within a week, Mrs. Brooks. But what about the immediate debt? What happens when they return and realize they are truly broke? I met her gaze, the decision firm in my eyes. We let them return. We let them discover they have no home and no resources. They need to face the rock bottom they tried to run from. When they inevitably call, desperate, I will be here. I will be the only safe harbor left. And only then will the education truly begin. Mrs. Rodriguez gave me a small, approving nod. A clever strategy, Mrs. Brooks. A slow, precise tightening of the noose. What about Mark's fraudulent use of power of attorney? Should we proceed with the litigation quietly? Yes. We need to build the legal defense for Sophie, but keep it a secret from her. I want the option to save her from the lawsuits, but she doesn't deserve to know she has a safety net until she has paid the emotional price for her betrayal. This is a game of patience, Ms. Rodriguez. We wait for the prey to fall into the trap they set for themselves. I left the bank that afternoon feeling lighter, stronger. I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was a strategist. I had a purpose, a plan, and the financial might to execute it flawlessly. Sophie and Mark were speeding across the Atlantic toward a glamorous but illusory future, unaware that every step they took was bringing them closer to the meticulously constructed maze their own mother had designed. They had thought they left me with nothing, but what they didn't know was that they had left me with everything: the truth, the power, and the motive. The immediate tasks kept me busy, and that was a blessing. I didn't have time to mourn the loss of my old life, only to plan the execution of the new one. Ms. Rodriguez moved with incredible speed and discretion. Within a week, the process to reclaim my condo was fully underway. It was a complex legal maneuver. Sophie and Mark had sold the condo, a two-bedroom unit in a pre-war Boston building, for a low cash offer of $450,000. They had desperately needed liquidity, sacrificing value for speed. The current buyer, a real estate flipper named Mr. Chen, was notified that the sale was based on fraudulent documentation and was legally voidable. Ms. Rodriguez's firm, acting on behalf of my new shell corporation, John's Sunset Trust, offered Mr. Chen a significant financial incentive to void the sale and quickly transfer the deed to the trust. He took the deal immediately, Mrs. Brooks, Ms. Rodriguez reported over a secure line. He made a quick profit and avoids months of litigation. The condo is legally yours again. We are listed as the owner under the trust's name. No paper trail leads back to Martha Brooks. I allowed myself a small, tight smile. Excellent. Now the car. The car was simpler. A 1998 Honda Accord. It was sold to a local mechanic for $3,000. Buy it back, Ms. Rodriguez. Whatever the cost. It was the last thing John gave me. She bought it back for $5,000, paying a small premium for the mechanic's inconvenience. Within 10 days of Sophie's shocking phone call, the two most tangible things she had stolen, my home and my means of transport, were back in my possession. But Sophie didn't know that. She was still under the impression that she had left me destitute and homeless. With the legal foundation secured, my focus shifted to the larger picture. The $10 million art collection and the $4.5 million Napa Valley vineyard. Ms. Rodriguez arranged for a small, secure warehouse space in a quiet industrial area outside Boston, where John's collection could be moved from the bank vault. I spent an afternoon there with a trusted curator, going through the pieces. It was a staggering display. Canvases from American regionalists, early pieces by abstract expressionists, and European landscapes that pulsed with light. John had an eye that was truly transcendent. He hadn't just bought art, he had collected forgotten masterpieces. My heart swelled with a fresh wave of pride and sadness. This was his love letter to me, hidden in plain sight. The vineyard, I decided, needed a different touch. I flew out to Napa under a new name, using funds entirely separate from John's main accounts. The vineyard was stunning. It wasn't a sprawling tourist destination. It was a boutique, highly profitable operation managed by a meticulous, long-time vintner named Thomas. He had no idea John was his true employer, only dealing with a large holding company in Boston. Thomas walked me through the rows of Cabernet Sauvignon, his passion infectious. The key to John's success, he said, adjusting his cap, was his patience. He never rushed a vintage. He never sold early. He just let the soil and the climate do their work. Patience. It was a word that resonated deeply. It was the core of my plan, too. I met with the vineyard's financial manager and learned something crucial about Sophie and Mark. Mark, while trying to secure last-minute funding for his doomed European trip, had attempted to use a forged deed for a partial ownership stake in the Napa property. He tried to pull $200,000 against this property, the manager said, shaking his head in disbelief. We shut it down immediately, but the attempt left a clear digital trail linked to Mark's defunct startup. This was a smoking gun. It proved Mark's intent to commit outright fraud, further strengthening Ms. Rodriguez's case to dissolve Sophie's legal liability down the line. It was evidence that he was not just fiscally irresponsible, but criminally deceitful. He was a sinking ship, and he was dragging Sophie down with him. After 2 weeks of silence, the waiting began to gnaw at me. I was living back in my condo, driving my old car, but the emotional atmosphere was thick with anticipation. I found myself checking the news feeds for any mention of a failed American startup in Europe. Then, one rainy evening, I got the call. It wasn't Sophie. It was Linda, my sweet, nosy neighbor from across the hall. "Martha, dear, I just got off the phone with Sophie's friend, Carol. You won't believe the gossip." Linda's voice was a hiss of pure excitement. "That big business deal in Europe? It was a flop, a total disaster. Carol said Sophie called her in tears, completely stranded. She and Mark are apparently broke, fighting constantly, and Mark's disappeared." The news landed not with a shock, but with the quiet confirmation of a prophecy. It had started. The walls were closing in. Mark, the rat, had abandoned the ship. Sophie was alone, adrift in a foreign country, with no money, no home, and a crushing amount of debt she didn't know the half of. I thanked Linda for the update, hung up the phone, and walked to the kitchen. I poured myself a small glass of wine, a bottle Thomas had insisted I take from the Napa vineyard. The wine was rich, complex, and required a slow, deliberate appreciation. I looked out the window at the rain-slicked street, imagining Sophie's frantic panic across the ocean. Patience, Martha. The harvest was approaching. It was time to wait for my daughter to come home and face the soil she had carelessly abandoned. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the roof, but inside the condo, the atmosphere was charged with a different kind of intensity. 2 more weeks passed without a direct word from Sophie. Only frantic, second-hand updates from mutual acquaintances confirmed my daughter was utterly alone and in freefall. Mark had indeed abandoned her. He'd taken whatever residual cash they had, along with the vague promise of European opportunity, and vanished. The digital trail Ms. Rodriguez tracked indicated he was somewhere in the south of France, desperately trying to secure residency through some dubious means. Sophie was stuck in Paris, alone, with a rapidly expiring tourist visa and creditors in the States who were now making serious noise. My days settled into a strange routine. By morning, I was Martha Brooks, the quiet, retired art teacher, exchanging pleasantries with Linda in the hallway and tending to John's small garden plot. By afternoon, I was the head of the John's Sunset Trust, a financial entity that could quietly change the fortunes of half of Boston. I continued my subtle investigation. The most painful discovery was the status of my painting, The Golden Sunset. Ms. Rodriguez located it at a small, reputable gallery in Chelsea, New York. Sophie hadn't simply sold it. She had unloaded it quickly to a dealer who knew its true value was far higher than the paltry sum she accepted. The act wasn't just materialistic. It was vandalism of a memory. I instructed Ms. Rodriguez to negotiate its immediate repurchase. It wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming the symbol of my love for John, the only piece of art I had ever created specifically for him. One morning, the doorbell rang, a frantic, repeated jab. I peered through the peephole and felt a jolt. It was Sophie, but barely recognizable. She was haggard, thin, and pale. Her expensive clothes, the tailored coat, the designer boots, looked rumpled, slept in, and worn down by travel and stress. Her eyes, usually sparkling with ambition, were hollow and red-rimmed. She was dragging a single battered suitcase. I opened the door, adopting the look of a worried but resigned mother. The performance began immediately. "Sophie," I exclaimed, my voice pitched with genuine shock. "What are you doing here? Where is Mark? I thought you were in Europe." Sophie collapsed against the doorframe, tears welling up instantly. "Mom, please, let me in. I have nowhere else to go. Everything is gone." I stepped aside, letting her stumble into the small foyer. The sight of her, the raw, unfiltered desperation, was difficult to watch. My mother's instinct screamed at me to hug her, to reassure her, to pull the plug on this painful lesson. But John's words held me steady. Use it for education. Gone, dear. What's gone? I asked, guiding her to the kitchen table. Everything, she choked out, wiping her face with the back of a dirty hand. The venture failed. Mark left me in Paris. He took the last of the cash and he was cheating on me. I had to beg a friend for a ticket home. She looked around the room, her eyes widening slightly. Mum, why does the apartment look the same? Did you move your things out? Move out, I said, feigning confusion. Where would I go, Sophie? The money you sent me only covers a few months of a very modest rental. I've been spending it sparingly, but I had a stroke of luck. The new buyer of the condo needed a few more weeks to finalize the sale, so I've been allowed to stay until the end of the month. This was the lie, the crucial point of no return in my plan. I needed her to believe I was operating on borrowed time and meager funds. Oh, thank God, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I thought I was going to be sleeping on the street. Mark took everything, Mum. He sold my jewelry. He emptied the joint accounts. And the creditors. They are calling me constantly. Creditors? I asked, my brow furrowed with concern. What creditors, honey? I thought you were starting a new business. It was a lie, Mum. All of it. Mark had debts, huge debts. Over $750,000, Mum. And he signed my name to some of the paperwork. They say because we're married, I'm responsible for all of it. They are threatening lawsuits, bankruptcy. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. I have no job, no money, no home. I don't even have a single belonging left, Mum. I've lost everything. She was right. She had lost everything. But what she didn't know was that her real loss wasn't the condo or the cash. It was the trust she had betrayed. And her greatest asset, the secret fortune that could erase all her troubles, was her mother, who was sitting right across from her, quietly planning the final, painful phase of the education. Well, Sophie, I said gently, patting her hand, you are my daughter. You can stay here for now. But you need to understand, I have almost nothing. We will have to live very simply. You'll need to start looking for work immediately. You can't rely on me to save you. I know, Mum, she whispered, her voice laced with genuine remorse for the first time. I promise I'll find a job. I'll pay for my share. I just need a place to hide for a little while. I nodded, maintaining the facade of the vulnerable widow. Rest, dear. We'll figure it out. But this is going to be difficult. Very, very difficult. In that moment, watching her broken and desperate, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, painful conflict. My heart ached for my child, but my strategic mind reminded me, the redemption cannot be purchased, it must be earned. The education had begun, and the final, most important lesson was just around the corner. The immediate weeks following Sophie's return were a masterclass in silent psychological warfare. I had to maintain the fragile illusion of poverty while secretly orchestrating the movement of millions. I had installed Sophie in her old bedroom, now stripped of its youthful charm and replaced with a spare, functional setup. I had to be careful. The condo had been thoroughly cleaned by a professional crew from the trust, and every trace of the supposed buyer was gone. I told Sophie I had spent days cleaning and purging my own things for the final move-out. Sophie was a wreck. She spent her days calling creditors, only to be met with cold, legal deadlines. She had no job, no immediate prospects, and the constant fear of being sued or even arrested. A genuine, bone-deep fear. This was the rock bottom John had prescribed, and it was painful to watch, but essential for the cure. One day I received the official confirmation from Ms. Rodriguez. The golden sunset painting was mine again. The gallery was reluctant to sell, Mrs. Brooks, Ms. Rodriguez informed me. They knew the painting's value had appreciated since the initial sale. We paid $65,000 for it, but the curator estimates it's worth twice that now. It's been delivered to the secure warehouse with the rest of the collection. Sophie had sold the one true piece of my heart for a quick, shameful fraction of its value. The repurchase felt like a symbolic restoration of dignity. My days were now split between two identities. In the mornings, I was the frugal, worried mother. I took Sophie to the local food pantry for groceries, explaining that my meager savings were almost exhausted. Sophie, deeply ashamed, initially refused to go, but necessity quickly broke her pride. "Mum, I saw Mrs. Peterson from book club there," she whispered one morning, mortified. "Yes, dear," I replied simply, loading cans of soup into the basket. "Trouble doesn't discriminate. We are all neighbours here." This interaction was crucial. It forced Sophie to face a reality where her privileged social status meant nothing. She was just another person in need. In the afternoons, I transformed. I would tell Sophie I was going to the library for research on affordable retirement living. Instead, I drove the recovered Honda, which Sophie believed I was borrowing from a friend, to Ms. Rodriguez's office. We focused on building Sophie's legal defense. Ms. Rodriguez used the evidence from the attempted Napa fraud to establish a clear pattern of criminal deception by Mark. "We have enough, Mrs. Brooks," the lawyer confirmed. "We can prove Mark acted unilaterally, forging documents and utilizing power of attorney outside of its scope, solely to defraud creditors and abandon his spouse. Sophie can be legally exonerated from all of Mark's corporate debt, including the largest loans, totaling over $600,000. "But she doesn't know yet," I insisted. "We file the preliminary motions, but no one, especially Sophie, can know she has a safety net. Not yet." I needed her to try to save herself, and she did. Driven by fear, Sophie started looking for work. But with an erratic employment history and the spectre of massive debt hanging over her head, which was visible on her credit reports, she was instantly rejected by every corporate job. The constant rejections crushed her spirit. One evening, she came home smelling of disinfectant and sweat. "I found something," she said, exhaustion etched onto her face. "A friend of an acquaintance. It's part-time, cleaning offices downtown. Night shifts only." I kept my expression neutral. "Office cleaning? Sophie, that's incredibly hard work." "I know, Mum," she said, managing a tired, genuine smile. "But it's cash. $15 an hour. It's better than nothing. And they didn't run a background check." My heart squeezed. My daughter, who had once spent hundreds of dollars on a single pair of shoes, was now valuing a $15 per hour night job. It was progress. "You need to pay me rent, Sophie," I said, hardening my tone slightly, maintaining the facade of financial stress. "Even if it's minimal, you need to contribute." "I will, Mum," she promised, her eyes burning with resolve. "I need to earn this. I need to earn everything." The following night, as Sophie left for her first shift, I watched her walk down the street, her shoulders slumped under the weight of her uniform and her shame. I knew that in a few hours, she would be scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins. It was a harsh and painful education, but it was the only way to teach her that the only things of true value are the ones you build and earn through honest labor, not the ones you steal or inherit. The bitter tonic of rock bottom was finally being swallowed. The arrival of Sophie's meager first paycheck marked a new, painful phase of the education. She was now earning her keep, paying me a small, symbolic amount of rent, $50 a week, and contributing to groceries. The money was insignificant to me, but to her, it was a lifeline, a badge of dignity hard won through long nights of scrubbing floors. The emotional toll was immense. She came home most mornings well after dawn, physically exhausted, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals and stale air. Yet there was a visible, undeniable change in her. The entitled arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility. She stopped talking about her European venture. She stopped blaming Mark. She started to blame herself, not for the consequence, but for the moral error. "I saw the way the other women look at me, Mum," she said one morning, soaking her aching feet in a basin of warm water. "They know I'm the one who messed up. One woman, her name is Elena, she works 2 shifts, so her son can go to community college. She doesn't complain. She just does it. And I was complaining about having to wash dishes." "Elena sounds like a good woman," I commented softly. "She is. She told me something that stuck with me. She said, 'Honey, you're here because you were rich enough to make big mistakes. I'm here because I wasn't rich enough to avoid the small ones.' I realized I had no idea what real struggle was." This was the first true evidence of her moral awakening. She was no longer viewing the world through the lens of her own wants, but through the shared struggles of others. Meanwhile, my secret life as the head of the John's Sunset Trust was getting more complex. Ms. Rodriguez and I were in the final stages of retrieving the Golden Sunset painting. The gallery, sensing a larger deal, became difficult. They hinted that they suspected the true owner was trying to buy it back. "They're pushing the price, Mrs. Brooks," Ms. Rodriguez warned. "They know the provenance is connected to John Brooks, and they sense desperation. They're demanding $95,000 now." "Pay it," I instructed without hesitation. "It is not a negotiation. It is a necessary acquisition. Get the painting and secure it." The painting was transferred that same week. I went to the secure warehouse alone. Seeing my own work, my canvas, hanging among masterpieces that sold for millions, was a strange, powerful moment. I touched the frame of the Golden Sunset. It was back where it belonged, the tangible symbol of the memory Sophie had casually discarded. The pressure on Sophie intensified. Creditors, realizing she was back in the US, began using harsher tactics. She received official summonses, legal documents demanding payment and threatening to involve the district attorney's office in some of Mark's more dubious dealings. This was the moment of maximum psychological pressure. One night, Sophie came home from work, collapsing onto the sofa, a thick, legal envelope clutched in her hand. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking violently. "This is it. They're suing me. Mark's bank, the one he used for the startup loan. They say I'm complicit. They're going after everything." "But you have nothing, dear," I pointed out, maintaining my calm, practical tone. "That's the point. They'll get a judgment, and I'll have this massive, unpayable debt following me for the rest of my life. I won't be able to rent an apartment, get a decent job. Nothing. Mark destroyed me." She finally broke down, deep, ragged sobs racking her body. I watched her for a long, agonizing moment. This was the absolute lowest point. She had nowhere to run, no one to blame but the man she had chosen, and the decisions she had made. Her fear was visceral, real, and completely necessary. "Sophie," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs, "you can't fight this alone. You need legal counsel. Now. I can't afford a lawyer, Mum. You know that. The initial retainer alone would be 10 times what I make in a month." I took the legal documents from her trembling hand. "I know an old colleague of your father, a lawyer who sometimes takes on pro bono work for friends of the family. Her name is Ms. Rodriguez. I'll call her in the morning. She might be able to offer a consultation. The introduction of Ms. Rodriguez was the critical, intelligent intervention. It gave Sophie a false sense of control and hope, making her believe she was finally taking a proactive step, unaware that the lawyer had been working on her case for months. "A free consultation?" Sophie whispered, a flicker of light returning to her eyes. "Oh, Mum, you really think she might help?" "She was a great friend of your father," I said, a slight, almost imperceptible emphasis on father. "And John always looked out for those he cared about. We have to try, dear. We always have to try." I held her close for the first time since her return, but my embrace was not just comfort. It was a calculated embrace. I was holding her up just long enough to guide her to the final, stunning revelation. The stage was set. The antagonist was completely broken. The time for the big reveal was imminent. The morning of the appointment, the air in the condo was thick with unspoken anxiety. Sophie was a coiled spring of nerves, constantly adjusting the cheap blouse she wore, the best she could salvage from her ruined wardrobe. I watched her, outwardly calm, inwardly managing the sheer excitement of knowing the full scope of my deception was about to hit her like a thunderclap. "Mum, are you sure Ms. Rodriguez won't mind the cleaning smell?" she worried, pacing by the window. I came straight from my shift. "She won't mind," I assured her, my voice steady. "She's a professional, Sophie. And this isn't about how you smell. It's about the lawsuit." We took the bus downtown. I deliberately chose public transport to maintain the illusion of financial hardship. It was a crucial detail. Sophie, who once disdained anyone riding the bus, now sat silent and watchful, gripping her worn briefcase as if it contained her last piece of hope. Ms. Rodriguez's office, high above the bustling streets, was a stark contrast to Sophie's desperate reality. It was all polished steel and leather, exuding quiet, expensive power. Sophie visibly shrunk, intimidated by the sheer competence of the environment. Ms. Rodriguez greeted us with cool, professional warmth, ushering us into her conference room. The large window offered a breathtaking view of the city, a world Sophie felt she had been permanently locked out of. "Ms. Brooks," the lawyer began, addressing Sophie, "your mother, a friend of your late father, asked me to review the documents regarding your creditors. The situation is severe. The debt is real, and the bank is moving aggressively." Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. The $750,000 is crushing me. I don't know what to do." "Well, let's start with the good news," Ms. Rodriguez said, sliding a thin manila folder across the table towards Sophie. "We have been quietly working on an angle for some time. We've found enough evidence to prove fraud and spousal abandonment on the part of Mark." Sophie stared at the folder, bewildered. "Fraud? But who paid for this investigation? I didn't authorize this." Ms. Rodriguez looked directly at me. It was the moment. The full, dramatic stop before the climax. I took a deep breath. "I did, Sophie." My daughter looked at me, confusion etched onto her face. "But Mum, you said you only had $50,000 in savings. You've been taking the bus and going to the food pantry with me." "Sit down, dear," I commanded, my voice losing its gentle, fragile quality, and taking on the firm, resonant tone of a woman in charge. "It's time you learned the whole truth." I turned to Ms. Rodriguez. "Show her the other file." The lawyer slid a thick, imposing file across the table. It was heavy, weighted with the truth. Sophie opened it slowly. Her eyes scanned the first document, the deed to the Napa Valley vineyard, listed under the Johns Sunset Trust. Her confusion deepened. "This is a vineyard? In Napa? What is this?" "Keep reading," I instructed. The next few minutes were a silent, visceral watch party of her slow-motion collapse. She flipped through the documents: the transfer of ownership for my condo, the bill of sale for my recovered Honda, the certificates of deposit, the stock portfolios, and the final, staggering appraisal of John's art collection. Her breathing quickened. She read the final number out loud, her voice a cracked whisper. $10 million in art? Mum, what is this? Who is John Brooks? He was your father, I said simply. And he was a genius. He built that fortune in silence, primarily to protect me from people like Mark, and frankly, from the potential for greed in people like you. Sophie threw the folder onto the table as if it had burned her hands. Her face was chalk white. The colour drained completely. She looked from me to the lawyer and back again, her eyes wide with shock and pure, unadulterated comprehension. You knew, she whispered, the accusation razor sharp. You knew all this when I came back here broken, when I was scrubbing floors at night for $15 an hour, when I was terrified of being sued. Yes, I confirmed, meeting her gaze squarely. I knew. Why? The word was a raw scream, echoing in the luxurious office. Why did you let me suffer? You could have stopped it all with a single phone call. Because you needed to learn something that money could never teach you, I replied, my voice hard, but laced with a painful love. You sold me out for a few quick dollars and a fraud named Mark. You discarded 40 years of my devotion. You needed to feel the true, crippling weight of having absolutely nothing, not just financially, but emotionally. Ms. Rodriguez intervened gently. Ms. Brooks, the money has always been here. Your mother used the resources of the trust to ensure that legally you are cleared of Mark's debt. We have filed the motions. The lawsuit against you is effectively nullified. You are debt-free. Sophie didn't register the relief. She was still fixated on the betrayal. You watched me go to the food pantry, knowing you owned a vineyard in Napa. Yes, I admitted. And in that pantry, you learned more about human dignity than you ever did living in New York. You found Eleanor, the cleaning woman, who taught you the value of honest labor. I didn't save you by giving you cash, Sophie. I saved you by allowing you to finally save yourself. The shock gave way to devastating sorrow. Sophie buried her face in her hands, her despair complete. She was debt-free, a multimillionaire's daughter, but she had never felt poorer. The revelation had achieved its goal. It had crushed her arrogance and broken her heart, paving the way for the painful, necessary process of true redemption. The game was over. The education had reached its zenith. The luxurious conference room was now a cage, and Sophie, moments ago a desperate runaway, was now trapped not by debt, but by the painful realization of her mother's strength and her own profound moral failure. She couldn't stop crying, but these weren't the tears of self-pity she'd shed over the past month. These were gut-wrenching sobs of true devastation and remorse. She wiped her eyes furiously with the back of her hands, leaving streaks of mascara on her pale cheeks. You let me clean toilets, she choked out, her voice raw. You let me go to a food pantry with strangers, knowing we had a vineyard, knowing you had $10 million in art. Yes, I repeated, my own voice tight with suppressed pain. I was teaching her, but the lesson hurt me too. I let you clean toilets because that job, that simple, honest labor, gave you back your dignity. You didn't steal that money, Sophie. You earned it. You bought your own bread with your own sweat. She pushed away from the table, walking toward the enormous window overlooking the city. Her back was to me, her shoulders shaking. I sold your car. I sold your home. I betrayed your trust and your love. And you You were buying back the condo and saving me from Mark's crimes. I forgave the theft, Sophie, I said softly. The money is just numbers, and the condo is just wood and plaster. What I couldn't forgive was the betrayal of family, the choice you made to discard me when I was most vulnerable. She turned back, her face streaked with tears, completely stripped of any artifice. I was horrible, Mum. I was entitled and greedy, and I let Mark convince me you were just a burden. Mark was a thief, but you were the one who made the choice to open the door for him. Now look at the file on the table, Sophie. Ms. Rodriguez is guaranteeing you are legally debt-free from Mark's mistakes. That is my unconditional love for my daughter. But you are not free from the moral debt you owe yourself. That you have to pay back with action. Ms. Rodriguez cleared her throat, sensing the emotional climax. Mrs. Brooks, I have arranged for Mr. Chen to transfer the full legal ownership of the condo to you personally, Mrs. Brooks. The John's Sunset Trust has served its purpose. I nodded. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. Now, Sophie, I want you to look at the last document in that file. Hesitantly, Sophie picked up the file again. The last page was a beautiful, full-color photograph. It was the golden sunset. My painting. My art, she whispered, her eyes widening. You got it back? Yes, I confirmed. I paid a high price for it. It is now safely stored with the rest of your father's collection. It was the one thing you took that was truly unforgivable, because it was a piece of my heart. It was a memory, not an asset. Sophie dropped the photo. She finally understood the scope of her mother's genius and sacrifice. Mum, she said, her voice barely audible. I don't know what to say. I'm sorry doesn't cover it. I don't deserve this. That's the first honest thing you've said, I told her, finally standing and walking toward her. I didn't hug her. Not yet. I just looked into her broken, repentant eyes. You don't deserve the money, Sophie, but you deserve a second chance, and your father left you one. I handed her the key to the safe deposit box, the one she had ignored. This key unlocks your financial future, but it also unlocks the rest of your life. The money is there. You can walk out of this office today, buy a new life, and forget this ever happened. But if you do that, the lesson will be lost, and you will simply become a new version of the greedy woman you were. I won't, she swore, gripping the key tightly. I can't go back to who I was. The guilt, the shame, it's too much. Then you have a choice, I stated, laying out the final terms of her education. Your father owned a working vineyard in Napa Valley. He loved the soil, the honesty of the harvest. I want you to go there. Sophie looked up, tears still streaming. To the vineyard? Yes, not as the owner, not as the boss. You will go there as an employee. You will start at the bottom. You will work with the soil. You will work with your hands. You will learn the value of something that grows slow and true. And for 1 year, you will live on the income you earn there. You won't touch the trust money. You won't touch the art money. You will live the simple, hard-working life you scorned. This was the final, ingenious twist, the socialized revenge. The punishment was not being poor, but being forced to earn the simple life she had thrown away. And what about the condo? She asked, looking back at the beautiful view of Boston. The condo is mine. I live here now. But if you complete the year at the vineyard, if you find your true self, then we will decide what to do with the future. But know this, you will never be homeless. You will never be alone. And you will never be debt-ridden because of Mark. That is my promise as your mother. Sophie's tears stopped. The shock had burned away the weakness, leaving behind a core of solid resolution. She looked at the key in her hand, the key to a fortune, and then looked at me, her face pale but determined. "I accept, Mum," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I will go to Napa. I will work. I will earn back your respect, and more importantly, my own." I finally reached out and placed my hands on her shoulders. "Good, my daughter. The lesson begins now. Go and plant something that matters." The drive to Napa Valley was a journey of forced introspection for Sophie. I had bought her a one-way ticket and handed her the coordinates to the vineyard manager, Thomas. She flew out of Boston 2 days after the confession in Ms. Rodriguez's office, leaving behind the shame of her greed and the comfort of the life she thought she deserved. I stayed in Boston, reclaiming the quiet, simple rhythm of my life, but it was now a quiet life, layered over a secret fortune. I spent my days tending John's garden and my evenings studying his art inventory. The house felt lighter, less burdened by the unspoken bitterness. Sophie called me 3 days after arriving. Her voice was strained, not by exhaustion, but by frustration. "Mom, I am here. It's beautiful. Yes, but it's work," she complained, the remnants of the old Sophie flickering. "I'm staying in a tiny cabin on the property, and the air smells like dirt and fertilizer. They assigned me to the maintenance crew. I'm weeding, Mum. I'm weeding." "You asked to earn back your dignity, Sophie," I reminded her gently. "Dignity doesn't come from a desk chair. It comes from the soil." "But they treat me like a high school kid. Thomas, the manager, he calls me the newbie. He had me cleaning out irrigation hoses all day." "Be grateful, dear. $15 an hour and clean air. It's a vast improvement over scrubbing other people's toilets for a similar wage." That comparison hit home, as it was intended to. She fell silent, then sighed heavily. "You're right. I'll call you later." Over the next few months, the calls changed dramatically. Initially, they were reports of misery, sore muscles, rough hands, and the indignity of having a low social standing. But then, subtle shifts began. "We had a heat wave today. Thomas taught me how to check the soil moisture levels using a simple probe. It's actually fascinating. It's like science. I learned how to prune the secondary shoots. If you prune too early, you lose flavor. If you prune too late, you lose yield. It's all about timing, Mum. Patience." The word patience resonated with me, mirroring John's core philosophy and the core of my own strategy. Sophie was finally embracing the wisdom of slow, honest growth. She wasn't just working, she was learning the rhythm of the land and the truth of value. I too was embracing change. I began to organize John's art collection for viewing. I decided to host a small, discreet showing at the warehouse, inviting only a few close friends and former colleagues. I couldn't keep this spectacular secret locked away forever. The showing was my socialized revenge phase 2. I wasn't just revealing my wealth. I was showcasing John's legacy and my own regained position. Linda, my gossipy neighbor, was invited, and she was speechless when she saw my apartment furniture set up next to a $2 million Rothko. "Martha," Linda gasped, clutching my arm. This is madness. You told me you were moving out. You were going to a home." "I was telling the truth, Linda," I replied, accepting a flute of champagne from a server. "The truth was just a little more complicated than I let on. John had a secret life, and now I'm the custodian of it." The gossip from that night spread like wildfire, reaching the social circles Sophie and Mark had once desperately clung to. Suddenly, Martha Brooks, the poor widow, was a fascinating subject of quiet admiration. I received calls from former friends who had ignored me after John's death, now eager to connect with the art matriarch. This quiet, powerful validation felt good, but my focus remained on Sophie. One day, Thomas, the vineyard manager, called me directly. "Mrs. Brooks, I know Sophie is your daughter. She told me the whole raw story. The debt, the betrayal, everything. She didn't have to, but she did. She's honest to a fault now." I held my breath. "And how is she doing, Thomas? Truly?" "She's the best worker I have," he said, a genuine warmth in his voice. "She works longer hours than anyone, never complains, and she has an instinct for the vines. She's found a real kinship with the soil. She's happy, Martha. She's found herself here." Thomas's words were the greatest relief I had experienced since John's death. The education had been successful. Sophie called later that day, not to complain, but to share a small triumph. "Mum, the other workers voted for me to manage the new block of Pinot Noir," she announced, excitement bubbling in her voice. "It's a huge responsibility. It's a difficult grape to grow, but I think I can handle it. I'm applying for a viticulture course at UC Davis Community College in the evenings." "That is wonderful, dear," I said, tears suddenly welling up in my eyes. The old Sophie would have scoffed at a community college. The new Sophie was embracing education and self-improvement with a fierce joy. "And Mum, I finally sold the last of my designer clothes online," she added, her voice dropping. "I made about $4,000. I'm not buying anything frivolous. I'm using it to pay for the first semester of that class myself. I need to earn this, Mum. I need to build a future that Mark can't take away, and that even the trust can't give me." In that moment, I knew she was truly free. The money, the vineyard, the art, it was all secondary. Sophie had discovered that her true wealth was her ability to work, to learn, and to grow. The harsh lesson had yielded the sweetest fruit. The redemption was complete. It had been exactly 1 year since the revelation in Ms. Rodriguez's office. 1 year since Sophie left her desperation in Boston and traded her Gucci heels for work boots in Napa. I flew out to the vineyard that weekend, timing my arrival for the end of the harvest, or vendange, as Thomas insisted on calling it. I hadn't told Sophie I was coming. I wanted the reunion to be simple, unfiltered. The Napa sun was brilliant, the air crisp and fragrant with fermenting grapes. I drove the recovered Honda, which I'd had shipped out, up the winding dirt road toward the main farmhouse. Everything about the vineyard felt honest and real. The land spoke of John's patience and foresight. I found Sophie in the sorting barn. She was covered head to toe in purple grape dust and sweat, laughing with the other workers as they inspected the clusters before crushing. She wasn't wearing any makeup. Her hands were calloused and stained, and she was radiant. I leaned against a dusty barrel and watched her. She was a woman utterly transformed. She had lost the nervous tension that once defined her and gained a solid, earthy confidence. "Hey, newbie," Thomas called out, clapping her on the shoulder. "Go get some rest. We're done for the season. You earned it." Sophie pulled off her work gloves, tossing them into a bin. She looked up, and her eyes found mine. The smile dropped, replaced by a deep, genuine joy. She didn't gasp or cry. She simply walked toward me, her gait strong and purposeful. "Mum," she said, her voice husky from hours of shouting over the machinery. "You're finally here." I stepped forward, and this time the embrace was everything I had yearned for. It wasn't the desperate, needy clutch of a month ago. It was the strong, equal hug of two women who respected each other. "You look," I started, pausing to find the right word. "Like a farmer," she finished, laughing. "I love it. I smell like yeast and dirt, and I haven't looked in a mirror in days." We spent the evening talking on the porch of her small cabin. She told me about her classes at UC Davis, her plans to eventually take over the blending process, and the quiet satisfaction of watching something you planted actually grow. I still can't believe all of this is ours, Mum, she said, gesturing toward the rolling hills of the vineyard. That Dad did all this, just in case. He knew you had a good heart, Sophie. It just needed some harsh pruning. You did the pruning, Mum, she corrected, giving me a knowing look. And you weren't gentle, but you were right. I realized when I was scrubbing floors that the most valuable thing I owned wasn't the condo. It was the key to this cabin, and the feeling that I earned the blisters on my hands. So what happens now? I asked. The year is up. You are legally free from debt, and you are financially secure. Sophie took a deep breath. I've made a decision. I want to stay here. I want to finish school and run this vineyard. It's beautiful, honest work. But I also want to use the rest of the fortune for something more. Something that honors Dad's quiet strength and your painful lesson. This was the final beautiful twist, the humanistic healing. I want to sell the golden sunset, she announced. My breath caught. Sophie, that painting is worth nearly $100,000. It's the one piece I bought back for myself. I know, Mum, but I want to sell it and use the proceeds to start a fund. A small, self-sustaining fund for women who are abandoned by financially abusive partners, just like Mark abandoned me. They need a bridge to independence, not a handout. They need the tools to grow their own vines. My eyes welled up, not with sorrow or anger, but with an overwhelming sense of pride. She wasn't asking for money for herself. She was giving away the symbol of her family's wealth to empower others. That, I said, my voice thick with emotion, is the most beautiful idea I've ever heard. Your father would be so proud. We spent the next day meeting with Thomas and Ms. Rodriguez, who had flown in to finalize the transfer of the vineyard's operational control to Sophie. It was clear Thomas respected her not as the owner's daughter, but as a dedicated farmer. During the meeting, Ms. Rodriguez mentioned Mark. Mark was finally deported from France a few months ago. He's back in the US and is facing several civil suits, but since you are legally separated from the debt, you won't hear from him again. Sophie merely shrugged. I don't hate him, Mum. He was the catalyst. If he hadn't betrayed me, I'd still be in that condo, complaining about the high price of lattes. He gave me the gift of rock bottom. Before I left, Sophie walked me to the Honda. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. This is the first thing I ever bought with my own money, she said, handing me the receipt. It's a small packet of heirloom Pinot Noir seeds. I bought them the first week I was here. What are you going to do with them? I'm planting them on the ridge tomorrow. They're difficult to grow, but I'm going to use them to start my own block, my own legacy. And when they're ready, I'm naming the first bottle after you, Mum. Martha's Reserve. It'll be a little sharp at first, but it will age into something wise and complex. I hugged her again, feeling the honest strength of her hands. I'll look forward to the first vintage, dear. I drove away from the vineyard, leaving behind a woman who had finally found her true calling. I hadn't just saved her from debt, I had saved her from herself. I was still the custodian of John's fortune, but the true treasure was the relationship I had rebuilt with my daughter, a relationship that was no longer dependent on inherited wealth, but on earned respect, shared work, and unconditional, clear-eyed love. The sun set over the Napa Valley, casting a golden hue over the vines. It was the perfect golden sunset. It has been 2 years since Sophie started her life over in Napa Valley, and my own life felt richer, more vibrant than it had in decades. The simple joy of my condo, which I now legally owned outright, was magnified by the knowledge that I had fought for it, not just for myself, but for the principle of integrity. Sophie's foundation, funded by the sale of the Golden Sunset, had officially launched. It wasn't a grand, corporate entity. It was called the Second Chance Vine, and it provided small, zero-interest loans and legal guidance to women starting over after financial abuse. The foundation's philosophy, which Sophie had written herself, mirrored her own journey. We don't buy the fruit, we fund the roots. The vineyard thrived under her management. She had finished her viticulture course and was now Thomas's trusted partner, responsible for the blending of the new vintages. She had found a true partner in a fellow vintner, a quiet, kind man named David, who respected her calloused hands and her sharp mind. Sophie flew back to Boston this weekend. We had planned a quiet dinner to mark the anniversary of the day she had left. As we sat at the same kitchen table where she had once confessed her utter ruin, the past felt like a distant, necessary dream. "I need to tell you something, Mum," Sophie said, her eyes shining with certainty. "I'm selling the heirloom Pinot Noir I started 2 years ago, the Martha's Reserve block." "The whole block?" I asked, a little surprised. "But that was your baby, your legacy." "It is," she confirmed. "But it's not going to be wine, it's going to be capital. I'm selling the harvest, and I'm using the proceeds to buy back the full ownership of the vineyard property from the trust. I want to buy it from you, Mum, at market value." My heart swelled. She wasn't asking for a gift. She was using her earned wealth, the wealth derived from the effort of her hands and her knowledge, to secure her future. "Why, Sophie?" "Because the trust is Dad's legacy," she explained. "The vineyard should be mine. I want to own the soil that saved me. And the money you get from the sale, Mum, I want you to use it to buy a piece of art that you truly love, that inspires you, not just one that funds a foundation." It was the final, perfect act of reconciliation. She was demanding respect for her self-made worth and giving back to me, not just affection, but a challenge to embrace my own dreams as an artist again. I reached across the table and took her hands, now rough and strong. "You've won, dear," I whispered. "You won your life back." "No, Mum," she corrected, a soft, loving smile spreading across her face. "We both won. You taught me the price of everything, and I taught you the value of yourself." Later that evening, I sat alone, reflecting on John's ultimate plan. Justice had arrived, not in the courtroom with angry judges and massive fines for Sophie, but in the quiet, dusty vineyards of Napa. The debt of betrayal had been paid, not with cash, but with sweat, humility, and profound, earned respect. The victory wasn't my sudden fortune, it was the woman my daughter had become. The most valuable asset John left me wasn't the art or the vineyard. It was the wisdom to know that sometimes a mother's greatest act of love is to step back and let her child suffer the consequence of their own choices, knowing that hardship is the purest catalyst for growth. The scars remain, a permanent reminder of the past, but they are covered by the new, strong, resilient skin of a healed family. I looked over at the small, empty space on the wall where the golden sunset once hung. I knew exactly what kind of painting I would commission with Sophie's earnings. It wouldn't be a sunset. It would be a strong, vibrant portrait of a young woman standing proudly in a field, her hands stained purple with the honest, beautiful fruit of her labor. What an incredible journey of redemption. If you've ever had to learn a painful lesson that ultimately changed your life for the better, let me know in the comments. Do you think Martha was right to let Sophie hit rock bottom? Or should she have intervened sooner? Share your thoughts below. And if you were Martha, which masterpiece would you buy to hang in your reclaimed condo? Don't forget to subscribe for more life-changing stories.